There is a specific frequency to wood right before it breaks under load. It doesn't scream. It groans. A low, barely audible stress fracture, deep inside the grain that only someone who spent 20 years working with timber would ever recognize. I was kneeling on the polished Italian marble of the Pinnacle Atelier, wearing a grease-stained canvas work apron, holding a brass scraper. 3 feet away stood Victoria Sterling, wearing a $30,000 silk gown, spilling champagne onto an 1800s mahogany balustrade I had personally hand-carved 5 years ago. She looked down at my scuffed steel-toe boots, laughed, and tossed her sticky glass directly into my brass tool bucket. She didn't recognize me. She didn't know that the woman cleaning her floors was the same artisan whose life she burned to the ground. And she certainly didn't know that in 48 hours, I was going to pull the key joist out from under her entire world. When someone takes everything you built, you have 2 choices. You can spend the rest of your life shouting into the wind, telling anyone who will listen how unfair the world is. Or you can get quiet. You can put on a pair of work gloves, step back into the building they stole from you, and study the blueprints until you find where they left the structural support exposed. My name is Elena Vance. 5 years ago, I owned Vance Architectural Restoration, the most respected historic preservation firm in the state. Today, I am the shadow technician fixing the water leaks in Victoria Sterling's vanity project. But by the time this night ends, Victoria is going to learn that you never build an empire on a foundation you didn't earn. The Dust and the Gold. The Pinnacle Atelier was advertised in architectural magazines as the crown jewel of the historic district. 4 stories of soaring archways, hand-molded plaster, and salvaged 19th-century oak. To the wealthy patrons sipping sparkling water at $40 a glass, it was a temple of refined taste, curated by Victoria Sterling. To me, it was a crime scene. I sat on my heels in the shadows of the mezzanine floor, smoothing down a piece of lifted walnut veneer near the service elevator. My fingers were calloused, stained with dark walnut oil that never quite washed out from under my fingernails. Victoria was standing 15 feet away, holding court with 3 city council members and a local real estate developer named Julian, her husband. Her voice carried across the high ceilings, sharp and ringing like silver cutlery dropping on tile. It took 18 months of painstaking design work on my part. Victoria was telling a councilwoman in a pearl necklace. When I bought this neglected shell, the interior was practically derelict. People told me it couldn't be saved, but I have an eye for potential that ordinary workers simply lack. I kept my head down, driving a micro-finishing nail into the floorboard with a copper mallet. Tap, tap, tap. 5 years ago, that neglected shell was the historic St. Jude Guildhall. I was the one who spent 14 months on scaffolding 40 feet in the air, restoring every foot of the hand-carved hammer beam ceiling. I was the one who personally sourced the salvaged white oak from dismantled barns across 3 states. Victoria didn't design a single beam. She bought the debt on the building after orchestrating a smear campaign that bankrupted my company, bought the asset at a sheriff's auction for pennies on the dollar, and slapped her name on the bronze plaque outside. She took a sip of her wine and turned her gaze toward the corner where I was working. Her eyes flicked over my faded denim work shirt, the tool belt slung over my hips, and the smudges of charcoal on my cheek. "Maintenance," she called out, snapping her manicured fingers twice. "You missed a scuff on the baseboard near the East Wing entrance. Make sure it's buffed before the evening private preview. I won't have dirt ruining the ambiance." "Right away, Mrs. Sterling," I said softly, keeping my voice low and flat. She didn't look at my face. People like Victoria don't look at the faces of people who carry toolboxes. They look at uniforms, dirty boots, and badges. To her, I was just part of the building's plumbing system, a necessary inconvenience required to keep the lights on. The destruction of Vance Restoration. To understand how I ended up with a scraper in my hand in a building I used to restore, you have to go back 3 years. Vance Architectural Restoration was a family business started by my father in a small timber yard outside the city. He taught me that wood has memory. If you force it against its grain, it will warp. If you respect its structure, it will stand for 200 years. When I took over the company, I built a reputation for absolute historic accuracy and uncompromising safety. We didn't do cheap drywall cutouts. We restored legacy timber. Then Victoria Sterling entered my workshop. She walked in wearing a white trench coat and sunglasses on a cloudy Tuesday afternoon, accompanied by two private inspectors. She had just purchased Sterling Manor, a landmarked 1880 estate on the north side of the city. She wanted my firm to renovate the grand ballroom. "I want the historic timber trusses removed," she told me, pointing a slender finger at the ceiling of my shop, where we kept structural samples. "I want a 3-story glass skylight dropped into the center of the ballroom roof." I pulled up the historic blueprints of Sterling Manor that night. The timber trusses weren't decorative. They were the primary structural tie beams holding the entire masonry facade together. Removing them without massive steel reinforcement would cause the load-bearing exterior walls to shear outward under roof stress. I called her the next morning. "Mrs. Sterling, I can install steel subframing to preserve the structural integrity, but it will take an extra 6 weeks for engineering approval and city permits. We cannot simply cut the beams." Her response was instant and cold. "I don't pay tradespeople to give me engineering lectures, Miss Vance. I pay them to execute my vision. Do it as drawn, or I'll find someone who will." "I won't sign off on a structural collapse," I told her. "It's illegal, and it's dangerous." That was the moment I sealed my fate. Victoria Sterling didn't accept the word no from a woman who wore work boots. The targeted ruin. Within 48 hours of my refusal, the machinery of high society revenge began to turn. It didn't start with a lawsuit, it started with whispers. Victoria sat on the board of the Regional Heritage Conservation Society. Suddenly, 2 major commercial preservation contracts Vance Restoration had secured were placed on administrative hold, pending an unexpected audit. Then came the health and safety inspectors. They arrived at my workshop 3 times a week, issuing minor citations for sawdust accumulation and timber storage heights. Simultaneously, anonymous reports were filed with our commercial insurer, claiming our structural work on a previous city project was fraudulent and dangerous. Our insurance premiums tripled overnight. Banks froze our working capital credit line. When I tried to reach out to longtime clients, people whose historic homes I had personally saved, my calls went straight to voicemail. One evening, my senior lead carpenter, Marcus, a man who had worked alongside my father for 20 years, stood with me in the dark workshop. The power had been cut because we couldn't clear the utility bill. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice quiet in the hollow space of the silent saws, "we can't pay the crew this Friday. The suppliers won't release the lumber without cash up front." "I have equity in the shop building," I said, my hands shaking as I looked over the balance sheets under a flashlight. "I'll remortgage it." "It's already done, Elena," he replied gently. "Julian Sterling's holding company bought the mortgage note from the local bank yesterday. They declared default based on the frozen credit lines. They're foreclosing on the shop next Tuesday." I stood in the dark, smelling the sweet, dry scent of cut oak and walnut, realizing the truth. Victoria hadn't just fired me. She had systematically dismantled my father's legacy, piece by piece, because I refused to let her break the law. When the sheriff locked the doors of Vance Restoration, Victoria Sterling bought the entire inventory of salvaged historic wood at a forced liquidation auction for 10 cents on the dollar. She used that exact wood to finish the interior of her new project, the Pinnacle Atelier. The covert return. Most people thought I left the state. They assumed Elena Vance was another ruined business owner who moved away to start over in some small town. Instead, I rented a tiny basement studio 2 blocks from the atelier. I cut my hair short, stopped wearing my signature leather work jacket, and applied for an entry-level position with Apex Facility Maintenance, the third-party cleaning and repair company contracted by Sterling Horizon Group to maintain their commercial properties. My supervisor at Apex was a tired, overworked man named Dave, who cared about 2 things: showing up on time and not getting complaints from high-maintenance venue managers. He looked at my resume, which I had stripped of every managerial title, listing myself merely as an experienced carpenter's assistant. "You know how to fix a sticking door and touch up plaster?" Dave asked, squinting through his bifocals. "Yes," I said. "Good. You're on the night shift at the atelier. The lady who runs the place is a nightmare. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't leave your tools in sight. And whatever you do, don't touch the artwork." For 2 years, I became invisible. I mopped the marble floors. I oiled the walnut paneling my team had sanded years prior. I fixed the door hinges Victoria's guest slammed. And while I worked, I listened. When you wear a maintenance uniform, people forget you have ears. Victoria and her husband Julian would stand in the private second-floor balcony, holding glasses of scotch, discussing financial details they assumed no one in blue coveralls could understand. The tax assessment came through on the building, Julian told her one rainy Thursday night, while I was wiping down the brass railing 10 feet below them. If we list the historic renovation costs at $6 million, we can claim the full municipal heritage tax credit, even though we only spent 2.2. And the remaining 3.8? Victoria asked, her voice light. Transferred into the Cayman Shell account under structural consultation fees, Julian replied with a low chuckle. No one audits historic preservation receipts. The line items are too obscure. I kept my cloth moving in steady, circular motions against the brass. Smooth, quiet, unremarkable. They thought historic preservation was obscure. They didn't realize that every single line item, every timber board, and every receipt passed through my mind like a familiar map. The discovery in the joists. The break I had been waiting for came during a routine inspection of the atelier's subterranean utility vaults. The atelier sat above an ancient network of stone foundations built in the 1870s. Because of my deep familiarity with the original municipal architectural archives, I knew something Julian's rushed construction crew had overlooked. When Julian converted the ground floor into a high-capacity gallery space, he wanted to remove 3 central masonry pillars to create an open-concept exhibition floor. His engineers had installed modern steel I-beams, but to save time and money on underpinning, they rested those steel beams directly on the original 19th-century timber mudsills in the basement subfloor. I descended into the damp, stone-walled cellar with a flashlight and a moisture meter. I knelt in the dirt, peeling back a rotting section of modern foam insulation that had been sprayed over the main supporting mudsill. My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribcage. Water was pooling against the oak timber. The drainage pipe from Victoria's newly installed courtyard fountain upstairs was leaking directly into the foundation bed. I pressed the metal prongs of my moisture meter into the wood. The display flashed red, 42% moisture content. Wet rot had taken hold deep inside the core of the main structural load point. I took out my pocket calipers and measured the deflection. The timber had already compressed by nearly 3/4 of an inch. The heavy steel beams above were slowly, silently sinking into the soft, rotting wood beneath them. Above my head, the floorboards groaned under the weight of 80 guests attending a private dinner party. I sat back on my heels in the cold darkness of the cellar, the beam of my flashlight reflecting off the dripping water. Victoria had cut corners to save $200,000 on foundation underpinning. She had built her grand, multi-million-dollar art gallery on top of a ticking structural clock. The paper trail of deceit. A structural defect alone wasn't enough to deliver complete justice. If the foundation failed, insurance would cover their losses, and Julian would simply file for corporate bankruptcy, leaving the city and contractors to absorb the damage. I needed the financial structure to collapse simultaneously with the physical structure. Over the next 4 weeks, I spent my off-shift hours in the Public Archives Library and the County Recorder's Office. I pulled every deed transfer, permit application, and lien report associated with Sterling Horizon Group over the past 5 years. That was when I stumbled upon the anomaly. When Julian purchased the St. Jude Guildhall from the city tax collector following my company's bankruptcy, he claimed the property was clear of encumbrances, but buried deep within an 1894 land covenant filed by the original builders, the St. Jude Artisans Guild, was an unextinguished deed clause. The clause stated that the land and any timber structural elements derived from the original construction could never be transferred to a private commercial entity without the unanimous consent of the Guild's designated successor board. If an unapproved transfer occurred, the title automatically reverted to the original Heritage Land Trust. And who was the sole surviving named trustee of that historic land trust? My grandfather, Arthur Vance. When my grandfather passed away 10 years ago, his trustee rights were assigned directly to Vance Architectural Restoration, my firm. Julian Sterling hadn't legally acquired the atelier at all. He had bribed a clerk to skip the covenant title search during the foreclosure proceeding. The deed he held was legally void from the day it was recorded. I sat at the library table under the pale fluorescent lights, staring at the yellowed parchment covenant. My hands were perfectly still. Victoria and Julian were hosting the annual Heritage Gala at the Atelier in 3 days, an event where they planned to announce the sale of the building to a foreign investment syndicate for $35 million. They were about to sell a property they didn't legally own, built on a foundation that was currently failing under their feet. Act Physi, the humiliation in the main hall. 2 days before the gala, tension at the Atelier was at a boiling point. Victoria was running around the main hall screaming at caterers, florists, and lighting technicians. She was dressed in an ivory silk suit, her voice echoing through the space like a whip. I was near the central archway, adjusting the latch on a set of historic oak double doors that weren't closing smoothly. My toolbox was open beside me on a canvas dropcloth. Victoria marched over, her heels clicking aggressively on the floor. She stopped right beside my workspace, her eyes glaring at the brass hinges. "Why is this taking so long?" she demanded, not looking at me. "The doors are sticking. I have the mayor arriving in 48 hours. "The doorframe has settled 3/8 of an inch, Mrs. Sterling," I said calmly, keeping my gaze on the brass screw I was tightening. "The weight from the floor above is pushing down on the lintel. Adjusting the latch is only a temporary fix." She finally looked down at me, her brow furrowing in irritation. "Are you telling me how doors work?" she sneered. "Just sand the wood down so it shuts. I don't need a lecture on settling buildings from a maintenance worker." As she spoke, she stepped back abruptly, her foot catching the lip of my open toolbox. A bottle of wood-stained solvent tipped over, splashing dark liquid across the hem of her cream-colored trousers. She gasped, taking a sharp step back as if she had been burned. "Look at what you did!" she shrieked, her face twisting in rage. "You clumsy idiot! Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" "You kicked the toolbox, Mrs. Sterling," I said quietly, standing up to my full height and looking her directly in the eye. For a fraction of a second, something crossed her face. A flicker of faint recognition, an unsettling feeling that she had seen my eyes before. But her arrogance quickly choked it out. "Get out!" she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "Dave!" she shouted across the room for my supervisor. "Fire this woman right now. Have security escort her off the property, and deduct the cost of my tailored suit from her agency's final invoice." Dave rushed over, pale and stammering apologies. He pulled my arm, motioning for me to pack my things. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I slowly knelt down, closed my toolbox, wiped the solvent off my brass scraper, and locked the latch. As security led me out into the heavy evening rain, Victoria stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at me with supreme contempt. "People like you," she called down, "always blame the world for your own incompetence." I wiped a rain droplet from my forehead, looked up at her, and gave a faint, calm smile. "Enjoy the gala, Victoria," I said softly. Act Physi, assembling the true guild. The rain was pouring hard when I walked into the small diner 4 blocks away. Sitting in a corner booth were 3 men in worn canvas jackets: Marcus, my former lead carpenter, Thomas, my historic masonry expert, and David, a brilliant forensic accountant who had lost his practice after blowing the whistle on one of Julian Sterling's earlier real estate scams. On the table between them lay a spread of technical drawings, land titles, and financial dossiers I had assembled over 2 years. "Is everything ready?" I asked, taking off my wet coat and sitting down. Marcus set down his coffee mug, a rare grin breaking across his weathered face. Thomas and I took laser measurement readings of the Atelier's exterior south wall from the public street this afternoon. The masonry line has deflected another ½ inch since last week. "The main subfloor beam is failing fast. If they put 200 people in that main hall tonight, the floor stress will hit critical capacity." David slid a thick manila folder across the table toward me. "The legal filings are complete, Elena," David said, his voice precise. "We submitted the emergency injunction petition to the State Supreme Court Chancery Division at 4 o'clock today, along with the original 1894 Guild Land Trust Covenant and your grandfather's deed assignment. We also filed a formal report with the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit regarding the tax credit fraud." "Has the judge signed the order?" I asked. David smiled. "Judge Vance, no relation to you, but a stickler for property law, looked at the title evidence, saw the clear fraudulent transfer, and signed an immediate emergency restraining order and structural closure notice. Sheriff's deputies are executing it tonight at 8:30. I looked down at the documents. The seal of the court was crisp and dark against the white paper. 8:30? I murmured, right in the middle of Julian's opening speech. Elena, Marcus said gently, leaning forward. They ruined us 3 years ago. They thought they bought our silence when they took our tools. But a builder knows how a house is put together, and a builder knows how to take it apart. I picked up my pen, signed my name at the bottom of the trustee declaration as the rightful executor of Vance Restoration, and closed the file. The Grand Heritage Gala. At 8 o'clock that evening, the street outside the Pinnacle Atelier was lined with black luxury sedans. Inside, the grand hall was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers threw brilliant light across the high ceilings. Valets in tuxedos served vintage champagne. Over 150 of the city's most powerful political figures, developers, and media executives milled about, admiring the salvaged oak paneling and masterwork paintings hanging on the walls. Victoria Sterling stood near the center of the room wearing a striking red designer gown, holding a glass of Dom Perignon. Beside her, Julian Sterling adjusted his silk bow tie, basking in the congratulatory handshakes of potential investors. Tonight, Julian announced to a small circle of reporters, we demonstrate what happens when private enterprise breathes new life into historic architecture. The Sterling Horizon Group has preserved the soul of this city. I walked through the front entrance of the atelier. I wasn't wearing my maintenance coveralls. I wasn't carrying a brass scraper. I was wearing a sharp, tailored black evening suit. My hair was styled, and my posture was straight and unyielding. Beside me walked David, holding a leather briefcase, and Marcus, dressed in a neat charcoal suit. The private security guard at the door, the same man who had escorted me out in the rain 24 hours earlier, stepped forward to block my path. Ma'am, this is a private invitation-only event, he said, reaching for his clipboard. I know, I said calmly. I'm the landlord. Before he could react, 2 uniformed state police officers and the county chief building inspector pushed past the glass doors behind me, carrying official court seals and a bright orange structural condemnation banner. The unraveling. The music from the string quartet slowed and stopped as the boots of the state troopers clicked loudly across the marble floor. Conversation died down instantly. Guests turned, murmuring in confusion as the chief building inspector marched straight to the main microphone at the front podium. Julian Sterling stepped forward, his face flushed with annoyance. What is the meaning of this? This is a private function. Who authorized this intrusion? The chief inspector didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses and spoke directly into the public address system. By order of the State Supreme Court Chancery Division, this building is hereby declared an active structural hazard due to severe subfloor structural failure and unpermitted foundation alterations. All occupants must evacuate the premises immediately. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Victoria pushed her way through the guests, her eyes wide with fury. This is absurd. My husband owns this building. Our engineers certified this space last month. Your engineers lied, Mrs. Sterling, I said, stepping forward out of the shadows into the full light of the chandelier. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. She stared at me, at my face, at my tailored suit, at the calm, steady posture she had spent 3 years trying to crush. The fog of her arrogance cleared in an instant. The memory clicked. You? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. The restorer, Elena Vance. Hello, Victoria, I said softly, my voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. You told me yesterday that people like me always blame the world for our incompetence. But it seems you forgot to check who actually owns the floor you're standing on. The paper and the timber. David stepped forward, opening his briefcase and pulling out a certified stack of court documents. Mr. Sterling, David said loudly, addressing Julian before the gathered media and investors. This injunction is accompanied by a federal seizure warrant issued by the state attorney general. The title deed you used to secure an $18 million mortgage on this property was fraudulently executed in violation of the 1894 Vance Heritage Trust Covenant. Julian turned pale, his eyes darting frantically toward his legal counsel standing near the bar. Furthermore, David continued, forensic audits have confirmed that $3.8 million in municipal heritage tax credits were illegally diverted into offshore holding accounts managed by Sterling Horizon Group. Two plainclothes investigators from the Financial Crimes Unit stepped forward, producing a set of handcuffs. Julian Sterling, one officer stated, "You are under arrest for grand larceny, municipal tax fraud, and filing false legal instruments. You have the right to remain silent." Victoria lunged forward, grabbing her husband's arm as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "Julian, do something! Call our attorneys!" Julian didn't answer. He looked down at the marble floor, completely defeated, as the officers turned him around and led him toward the exit through the crowd of horrified investors. Victoria whirled around to face me, her eyes burning with pure venom. "You set us up!" she screamed, her composure completely shattered. "You worked in my building for 2 years, hiding like a coward." "I didn't hide, Victoria," I said calmly, taking a step toward her. "I worked. I fixed the things you broke. I listened to the joists groan while you drank champagne. I didn't set you up. I just let your own greed finish the job my father's timber warned me about." The final inspection. Within 30 minutes, the grand hall was completely empty. The high society guests, the politicians, the investors, and the reporters had all been ushered out into the street. The bright orange, danger, structural hazard, do not enter signs were posted across the heavy oak front doors. I stood alone in the center of the silent ballroom, with Marcus, Thomas, and the chief inspector. In the subterranean basement below, city contractors were already installing temporary heavy steel shoring posts to prevent the subfloor from collapsing completely. Victoria Sterling stood near the threshold under the watch of a police deputy, waiting for a private vehicle after her car was impounded as part of the asset seizure. She was shivering in her red dress, her designer coat left somewhere inside the sealed building. I walked over to the grand entrance, carrying my old brass tool bucket, the one she had thrown her empty glass into 2 nights ago. I set it down on the top step beside her. The city has appointed Vance Architectural Restoration as the official court-ordered receiver for the property, I told her quietly. "We will be underpinning the foundation, restoring the historic timber properly, and converting the building into a public trade school for young artisans." Victoria looked at me, her lips trembling, stripped of every piece of social status and borrowed wealth she had used to terrorize others. "You destroyed my life," she whispered. "No, Victoria," I replied, looking out at the city street where the rain had finally stopped. "You built a house out of paper cards and lies, and then you invited the wind inside. I just opened the door. The rebuilt foundation." 6 months later, the sign outside the building at 440 Heritage Way was changed. The bronze plaque that read, "The Pinnacle Atelier, curated by Victoria Sterling," was removed. In its place, carved deeply into a massive plank of solid white oak, were the words, "The Vance Guild School of Architectural Craft." Inside, the sound of power saws, copper mallets, and laughter echoed through the open hall. Marcus was standing at a long workbench, teaching 6 young apprentices how to hand dovetail walnut drawers. Thomas was showing a group how to mix traditional lime mortar for historical masonry restoration. Julian Sterling was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for financial fraud and tax evasion. Victoria Sterling was forced to declare personal bankruptcy to satisfy the restitution orders filed by the city and former creditors. She currently lives in a small apartment 2 states away, her social network completely dissolved. I stood on the second-floor balcony, the same balcony where Victoria and Julian once stood looking down on me, holding a hot cup of black coffee. My hands were still stained with walnut oil. My boots were still scuffed. I looked down at the new floorboards we had installed over a reinforced steel and solid oak foundation. The wood didn't groan. It didn't strain under load. It stood solid, quiet, and strong. True power isn't about standing on top of people in a silk dress. It's about knowing how to build something that lasts long after the vanity of the world has crumbled away. If Elena's story reminded you that patience and craftsmanship will always outlast cheap arrogance, Hit that subscribe button for the silent Valkyrie. And tell me in the comments below, what would you have done if you found the flaw in your enemy's foundation? Never fear the person who boasts about what they own. Fear the person who knows how every single piece was put together. Until next time, stay quiet, build strong, and stand your ground.